I've been painting since the time I was a kid, but never in my life have I ever used acrylic paints. Today is going to be my first time. If you know me already, I am a gouache artist. I love gouache. I also like working with watercolor and oil pastels once in a while. I have worked with oil paints when I was younger, but it's been maybe 10 years since I even touched those. So I am pretty out of touch with working on a canvas itself. But this is going to be my first time with acrylic paints. I picked up a whole bunch of materials to try out, and I'm going to be doing all of it on camera, completely raw and unfiltered. So you get to see the process, you get to see what I feel about it as a gouache artist transitioning into acrylic. Let's see what I feel about it. So a few months ago, I don't know what gave me the urge to do this, but I just felt like I wanted another medium to explore. Gouache is the main medium that I work with. I also am pretty familiar with watercolors, but I just wanted to try something new for a change. And so I headed over to Hindustan Trading Company, which is my local art supply store, which by the way is an amazing destination for all art supplies and stationery. If you'd like to shop from them, you can shop online. They ship all over India, and you can use code Shivani10 for 10% off. Anyway, I headed over there and I picked up a whole bunch of supplies to start my acrylic painting journey. Since then, they've been lying in my cupboard for about 6 months. But let me show you everything that I got, and I decided it's time now for me to try it out and give it a shot. And I'm just going to share my experience with you as it happens. I honestly know nothing much about the medium, but let's start. So starting with the paints, I decided to try out Winsor & Newton Galeria acrylic paints. I generally prefer to have a limited palette, so I didn't want to get too many of the basic primary colors. This is just a sample I had received long ago, so that's why this one is used, but I haven't done anything with it myself. But yeah, so I decided to go with a cadmium yellow, and then there's a cadmium red. I have a permanent alizarin crimson as well, so that would give me like a much deeper and cooler hue of red. Then I've got cobalt blue hue. This is the one I bought. This is one that was just lying with me, which is phthalo blue, so I can try that out as well. Then I've got a few neutrals. So I've got Naples yellow, I've got burnt sienna and raw umber. Then there's Payne's grey, and I have a lamp black, and I have two whites. So there is a mixing white and there's titanium white. I'm interested to try them out and see what happens when I use mixing white, because it's supposed to lighten colors without killing their vibrancy, which is something that tends to happen when you mix white or black into your colors. So I'm going to try darkening colors with Payne's grey and see what happens. Try lightening with mixing white and see what happens. Let's see. Other than that, I have got a couple of palette knives just to try them out, to mix my colors, also to apply onto the canvas. I got a set of 6 brushes. So it seems to be a good mix of types of brushes and sizes of brushes, which is something I typically like to have. So we've got round brushes in size 6 and 16. So one is nice and small, one is bigger. Then we've got 2 flat brushes, size 8 and 10, and we've got 2 filberts also in size 8 and 10. I didn't want to use my existing watercolor brushes because I know that acrylic, once it's dried, you can't really clean it up. I don't want to by mistake damage my brushes. So this is what I'm working with today. Then I've got some Montmartre gesso, which I'm going to use to prime my canvas. I also got this kind of inexpensive brush to use for the gesso, so I can use this to apply the gesso coat onto my canvas or my paper. Then I got canvases in a bunch of mixed sizes just in case I want to experiment a bit. So these are really small ones. This is about 4 by 4 inches, really tiny. Then I've got 5 by 7 and I've got a 6 by 6. And I just got one canvas that's larger. This is 12 by 16. I am not sure which one I'm going to use today, but let's see. I do want to paint something more detailed. Right now I'm feeling like I should have got something that's kind of in between, but I didn't. So let's see. Then I got this acrylic mixing palette, but I also got this tear off paper palette. So I basically watched a lot of videos about acrylic painting. I tried to understand how different artists tend to use the medium. And then I got a mix of things to try different things and see what works for me, because usually what works for somebody else may not necessarily work for you. So it's important to try different things, especially when you're trying a new medium. So I got this random mix and I'm gonna work with it and see what happens. I've also, aside from this, just kept some paper. This is not bought for this, I already had this. I've kept some paper ready. I've kept a jar with some water. And yeah, that's pretty much it. This is what I have on hand. I also have a waste piece of cloth. So I am going to be experimenting and let's see how this goes. To start off with, I think I should definitely do a bit of swatching and color mixing. That's usually my first step with any kind of paints. So let's start there. And meanwhile, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to open up one of these. So I'll open up the 6x6 canvas and I'll start by applying gesso on it. Let's see how long that takes to dry and how it turns out, because I really don't know what to expect. And as a disclaimer also, again, I would like to mention that this is a medium I am absolutely new to. I know nothing about it. This is an experiment. And so if I make any mistakes, please be forgiving and feel free to let me know in the comments. Let me know your tips about working with the medium as well. I'm sure I'll find it helpful for the next time I paint. But yeah, just be kind, because I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just going to see what happens. Okay, so I've opened up this canvas. Since this one is still wrapped in plastic, I'm just going to use that as my backing while I apply this gesso. I would usually use newspaper, but I don't have that on hand right now. So let's work with this. And I'm opening up this brush. So yeah, I think these bristles are soft enough, but they're also stiff. So I think this should work well for applying gesso on the surface. Let's see. Let me open up the gesso. Okay, great. It looks very creamy. Okay, I've already got some on my hand. So I'm just going to dip my brush into this and take some up. Again, I'm not really sure how much to use, but I'm taking about this much. Let's see how this goes. And one tip I saw another artist suggest was to brush in one direction at a time, and then I could possibly do a second coat which goes in the other direction. But for now, I'm going to keep it in this up to down direction. So I'm also making sure to cover these edges while I'm doing this. Okay, great. So I think that looks like a reasonably smooth first coat. I'm going to let that dry. I'll tell you how long it takes to dry. I'm just going to remove the remaining paint from my bristles. Sorry, I mean gesso from my bristles. Just get that onto the canvas as well. So I'll keep this aside to dry and let's see how long it takes, and then I can put a second coat in this direction. Meanwhile, what I will also do is I'll take some paper. Okay, so I've got some of the Canson Montval watercolor paper here. So this is a cellulose based watercolor paper. Just as an experiment, I'm also going to apply some gesso on one half of the paper, because I would like to observe what the difference is when I paint without gesso and with gesso, and I will share that with you too. So I'm just applying some gesso on one side of this paper. Again, I'm going to leave this to dry. Okay, I'm not sure if it's a good idea to wash the gesso in this water where I'll also be washing off my paints. So I'm going to pause the recording and wash it under the tap. Let me know in the comments if this is not recommended. I would love to know. I'll wash it off under the tap and I'll change my water into fresh water, and then I'll start swatching the colors. Okay, so I've got some fresh water here, and I've got out my sketchbook. This is the Speedball watercolor sketchbook. I think the paper is 220 GSM. I use it for a lot of pencil sketching and gouache work. I will do my color mixing exercise here. I've also opened up this tear off paper palette, so I'm just going to be mixing my colors here, and this can just be torn off and thrown away once you're done painting. Which I think is pretty handy with acrylic, because compared to these kind of traditional palettes, the plastic palettes which you might use with watercolor or with gouache, it can be quite a hassle with acrylic, because I know you can't reactivate the paint once it dries on your palette and you have to peel it off. So if you're doing small projects, I feel like this might be really handy. And this comes with 36 sheets. It has a kind of plasticky surface to the paper. Anyway, let's test it out and see what happens. So we're just gonna go crazy with mixing colors now. I think I'll start with the size 8 flat brush. Let's start with the cadmium yellow. We'll start by swatching all the colors, and then maybe we can do some mixing with the primaries and see how they behave with each other. Okay, I may have taken out too much, but I'll use it for mixing other colors, so it's fine. And I've also got a little spray bottle with some water in it, so in case I need to mist my colors, that would be useful. Now I know that you're not supposed to mix too much water into the acrylic paints, so I'm keeping my brush relatively dry. I just made it a bit damp so that it's easy to handle the colors, and I will swatch that. That's a really pretty shade of yellow. It's a nice, slightly warmer shade of yellow. And when you're using acrylic paints, I know that it's important to wash your brush off thoroughly while you're changing colors. You also don't want any paint to be drying up in your bristles, because it can be really hard to get rid of that. So next we will try the cadmium red. Let's put that here. I really like the quality of these paints. I haven't tried much of acrylics, of course, but it does feel really creamy on my bristles, which I like. One thing I'm noticing is that compared to a medium like gouache, it's not as easy to get rid of the paint from my bristles. It is taking a lot more vigorous washing in the water to get rid of the paint. So now I have permanent alizarin crimson. So I think there was a little too much water on my brush, which I can see there. So I'll add more pigment. With any paint medium, you'll find that some pigments tend to be a little more transparent than others. I'm seeing that in this case as well. I'm taking out some burnt sienna. Actually, I'm going to just take these onto my brush directly, because I just want a little bit. I don't want to lay out too much on my palette. I'll be using these to mix colors, so that's fine. For the rest of the colors, I'm just going to possibly take it onto my brush. Okay, this seems to be very transparent. I don't know if my brush is too wet or the color is extremely transparent. I'm just gonna try a bit more after drying my brush. Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I think the pigment is pretty transparent for this burnt sienna. This one's a raw umber. This is also a nice neutral to have on your palette. So basically, when I was selecting the colors to add to my palette, I did watch a few videos to see recommendations, and in general, I like to work with a custom palette and a limited palette. So what I mean by that is I prefer to buy individual colors rather than buying a set and ending up with a bunch of colors that I definitely don't need. So this is Payne's Grey. So it's got a beautiful indigo kind of undertone to it. I really like this color. It's very pretty. I love Payne's Grey even in watercolors. So definitely wanted that on my palette. Anyway, as I was saying, when I select colors, I typically like to have a limited palette, and as you can see, I didn't buy any greens. This is a kind of greenish blue, which is interesting, but that's not even from the colors that I bought. That's just something I happen to have on hand. But I decided to go with colors that overall would allow me to mix every color that I need. I love color mixing. Color mixing is one of my superpowers, and I love teaching it to my students as well. I've done a lot of it with gouache, but the concepts apply no matter which medium you're painting with. So I know that I'm strong with color mixing, so I decided that this should be enough in terms of the bright colors, and then having some neutrals really rounds off my palettes, and with these colors I can basically mix anything that I want to. This lamp black is beautiful. It's a really nice opaque pigment. I like that. Then I've got the titanium white. Now I'm not sure if we'll be able to see this, but I'm going to swatch it anyway, and we'll also use it in mixing. So I'll just lay some out here. Okay, you probably can't see it on the camera, but it is a nice opaque white. Seems to be a nice strong pigment. And there's the mixing white, which I'm not going to swatch, but I will use it in the mixing. So now that I have my colors laid out, what I'm going to do next is just try to mix a bunch of different shades using the primary colors, and mix some secondaries, mix some tertiaries, just explore and see where it leads. So I can already feel that the part that's spread on the palette is kind of drying. I'm just going to mist the palette a little bit just to make sure the colors are hydrated and not drying too much. Okay, so I've got some yellow. And I'm going to keep this just very free flowing. I'm just going to keep mixing whatever comes to mind. Okay, so here I'm using the cadmium red with the cadmium yellow to mix a nice orange. By the way, if you'd like to learn color mixing from me, I have a really good online course, and you can check out the link in the description for that. This is a nice bright orange. I'm also going to compare that with, let's say if I mix the cadmium yellow with a bit of this crimson, let's see what happens in that case. So this is a cooler red and that was a warmer red. So as you can see, this orange is a lot more muddy. So these are all, like I said, these are just concepts that apply no matter which medium you work with, and once you get strong with color mixing, you can very easily adapt to any different paint medium without having to think too much about it. because it's all just understanding pigment and understanding color. It's not even about the medium. So if you'd like to explore that further, please do consider signing up for my color mixing course. It's really strong and good foundations that are useful for any artist. So now I'm just mixing a bit of white into this orange. Mixing white also helps you see the undertones of colors better. That's a really nice light orange. And I'll mix some into this as well. Next, I'm going to take a little of this red and mix it with a little of this blue to make a purple. This is a nice bright purple, quite like that. So this was the cadmium red with the cobalt blue. And again, I will take a touch of white into that. So the paint was getting a little dry. I think I ran short of paint there, so I tried adding some water into it, but that didn't feel very good. It didn't work the way I expected it to because I'm so used to gouache. So I think you need to make sure that you're working with enough pigment on the palette when you're painting with acrylics. That is my observation at the moment. By the way, let's see if this has dried. Yep, this seems like it's dried. So the gesso that we applied on the paper has definitely dried. The one on the canvas doesn't seem to have dried yet. So that's still a little wet. So we'll give that some more time. Now I'm going to take a bit of crimson red with the cobalt blue. I expect that this is going to be the brightest purple, but let's see. So as you change the ratio of the blue and red or the primaries in the mix, you'll see different colors emerge. This is feeling a little bit more reddish to me, but while I paint it, it looks okay. Let me just add a little more blue to see what happens. This is a nice bright purple, like that. And I'll add some white. Okay, so now let's try mixing a few greens as well. So again, taking some yellow, and this time I will take the cobalt blue again. Let's mix that. So I think if you want to thin down your acrylic paints, it would be much better to get some mediums to do that. Acrylic paints come with a lot of medium options. I don't think adding too much water to it is the right answer because it kind of changes the properties of the paint and doesn't act very well. And I want to add a bit more yellow and see what happens if I try to do a slightly more yellowish green. And yeah, I think you really need to be careful about how much paint you are squeezing onto your palette because you can end up with a bit too much wastage if you squeeze out too much paint. Because once the paint dries on your palette, it's just pretty much done. I'm just exploring now because I always love mixing all the primary colors together in different ratios to see what comes out of it. So I'm just going to explore that a little bit now. You'd be really surprised if you really take the time to explore your primary colors to see just how many interesting shades you're able to mix with them. Like, look at this. This is such a pretty shade. You'll be able to mix things you didn't really think of or didn't really think were possible just by mixing your primary colors together in different ratios and possibly by mixing a bit of black or white into it. This exercise, I've just used the primary colors that I have without even adding any black into it. You can get really interesting shades of gray by exploring things like this without even using black in your mix, because when you mix the three primary colors together, they kind of cancel each other out. Another thing I'm going to try doing right now is using the mixing white. So this is the mixing white. I'm going to try adding it into this gray that I've mixed up to see what happens. Okay, I can feel on my brush that it's kind of thinning down the pigment and it's lightening the color, but it's definitely not making it less vibrant. Let's compare that with if I were to mix regular titanium white into it. Let's see what the difference is. Maybe gray wasn't the best color, but so this is the same amount approximately of mixing white that I had mixed on this side of the gray. So I'll mix that much of titanium white here. You can see the huge difference. This is doing something a lot more drastic to the color by adding just the same amount of paint. You see? So this is the thing about using mixing white versus titanium white. This doesn't dull out your colors, whereas you can see in this it's taken away a lot of the vibrancy. I can still lighten this further by adding more mixing white into it. Like I can just pick up more of it and further lighten, and I think that would still keep it more vibrant in color than this one. So that's interesting. I'm also going to test out this Naples yellow. I think I forgot to swatch it as well, so taking some of that out. This can also be an interesting mixing color, especially if you work with a lot of earthy tones. This is a nice way to kind of lighten some of your colors. Of course, it will change the color a little bit because it does have this Naples yellow pigment in it, but at the same time, it is again not going to do something very drastic to the vibrancy of your colors. So this might be interesting, let's say if you want like a lighter shade of red. See, it looks so pretty. So this is the crimson red with a little bit of Naples yellow added in, and let's add a bit more. So of course, if you add it beyond a certain point, it's going to change the color like I said, but it's still really nice to play around with and see. Okay, so my canvas is still wet. I think this is done with the color mixing for now. There's a lot more I'm going to play around with, but probably not for the sake of this video. So I'm going to keep this aside for now. We've done a bit of color mixing to see what happens. Let's take this paper. So this paper, like I said, it dried pretty fast, and I'm going to paint. So it did warp the paper a little bit. So I think if you want to use gesso on your paper, I would suggest taping it down with masking tape or washi tape so that you don't get this kind of warp that's happened to the paper. Now I'm just going to try to paint some color on both sides and observe the difference in feel. I will take some of this burnt sienna. I'm interested to see how this burnt sienna behaves because when I swatched it, it felt extremely transparent. Yeah, the pigment definitely feels very transparent. So I'll add some Naples yellow into it. Maybe that would thicken it up because the Naples yellow pigment feels very opaque compared to this. So yeah, this looks nice. So let me paint that here. So of course, because I'm painting on paper, if my brush is dry, I do get this kind of dry brushy kind of feel to it. While I'm doing this, let me also try blending some color. I'm just not at all used to this kind of feel on my brush. I'm so used to gouache, which is so creamy on the brush and just easier to spread, I would say, compared to this. So let me also take some lamp black. Okay, so I will mix some of this with lamp black as well, just to get a dark shade, and I'm going to apply that here. My paint should still be relatively wet, but yeah, it's not blending like how I would have thought. In fact, it's making a bit of a mess. So I guess this is probably not the best way to blend acrylics. May need to do some research on that. But what I am liking is that as I'm layering the paint, it's getting a lot more opaque. I was just trying to get a kind of smooth blend, but that did not happen very well here. Maybe I don't know how to do it yet, but yeah. Okay, I am so sorry, but while I was painting on the gessoed surface, my camera ran out of charge and therefore that entire section did not get recorded. But my observations were basically that it was a lot smoother to paint on the gessoed surface. In fact, let me just paint a section down so that you can just see. I'm not sure if on the camera it's even visible, but I felt like the paint glided on a lot more smooth on the gessoed surface, and also it seems to be adhering to the paper a lot better, which is the entire point of gesso. It's supposed to prime your surface, and this gives you an opportunity to also use it on lesser expensive papers. You don't need to worry about the paper too much. You can use any paper, just prime the surface, and you can then use acrylic paints on it. So I think I am for gesso. Seems like a good idea to prime and then use the paper. Let me just get this here. So we keep that away for now and get back to the canvas. I can see that it still has a shine to it. Yeah, it's still a little wet, and it's been about 40 minutes, I think, since I primed it. So I'm going to continue to let that dry, and once that's dry, we can start talking a little bit more about painting. Until then, there were a couple more things I wanted to try. So firstly, I want to try darkening a color with Payne's Grey versus darkening with black. So that would be kind of similar to our experiment with the whites. So hopefully the Payne's Grey still retains some vibrancy. That's what it's supposed to do. So let me see. So I have got now some Payne's Grey on my palette here and some black here. I will mix both of those with, let's say, red again. So let's take some cadmium red here. Okay, so firstly I'm going to darken it a bit with blue, but I do expect a kind of purplish tinge to emerge. But let's say I wanted to go really dark with it. So yeah, it does have this purplish tinge, but I can see that the color does look pretty vibrant, and once you paint it, I expect it to look almost black-like, like quite dark, especially once you layer the paint. So yeah, that's definitely a nice way to create a dark shade without using black, because like I said, black and white tend to kind of kill your vibrancy and deaden the colors. and they don't look like how colors look in the real world. In the real world, colors don't exactly look like that. Even when colors are in shadow, they have these undertones. Unless they're in pure black shadow, it doesn't ever look like that in real life. Sorry, I'm searching for my red. Yeah, so I'll take some more red and we will darken it with black, and that would end up with something a lot more brownish. This one has a kind of purplish undertone, and it's completely fine to use black. This is not me saying that you should never use black. I also use black, especially because I do naturalist paintings. So when I'm painting birds, if a part of the bird is black, then I definitely do use a lot of black to depict it. But this is just to say that you have options. You don't always have to use black. In fact, I use black very little. I use it only when I'm actually trying to show black. If I'm trying to show shadows, I use the primary colors, or I use these kind of mixes to create my dark tones instead of using black. So yeah, let's put a little bit more red. So yeah, it does end up with a lot more brownish mix, and when you mix white into that, you'll really see the difference, where this looks really grayed out, whereas this one would not look as grayed out as that one does. And like I said, this of course will have a kind of purplish undertone, but you can add a bit of yellow and change that as well, because yellow is the complement of purple. But I don't want to get into too many confusing details. I always get a little carried away when it comes to color mixing. If that's something you're interested in, another reminder to check out the course in the description. But for now, that's all I wanted to play with. And the last thing I want to do before we actually paint on the canvas is I also wanted to try out this filbert brush. Filbert brushes are really interesting because compared to flat brushes, while they do a lot of similar strokes to flat brushes because they are also flat, they do have this rounded tip, so they help you create these very natural shapes. And if you're doing things like trees, they can give you a lot more soft and natural look as compared to using a flat brush. But they're not an absolute must. I've been painting for 3 years and I got a filbert brush only this year. So it's definitely not an absolute must, but it's a good to have brush. And like I said, I also paint a lot of birds, so these really come handy there, because they help me get those feathery textures as well. And while we're at it, let's also just try out this round brush. Every time I feel like my brush has way too much water loaded on it, I'm just kind of using my cloth here to dab it off. Round brushes are, of course, the most common, the most versatile brushes that you can have. It's like a must-have. You cannot have a collection of brushes that does not include any round brushes. But having a really good round brush which comes to a fine tip is always great, because then you can get a lot of fine lines in addition to your usual painting of shapes and everything else that a round brush, of course, does a great job of. Having one that comes to a nice fine tip gives you a lot of versatility in what you can do with the brush. Okay, so I am on day 2 of acrylic painting. I allowed this to dry well yesterday, and then I put the second coat of the gesso in the other direction, like I told you about. I allowed it to dry under the fan, and I found like that was so much faster drying. So now I've just sketched out this little lemon using a reference image from Unsplash. And I'm going to start painting with it, and if I have any thoughts during the process, I'll share that with you. I have also got a small acrylic palette with me this transparent palette on which I can mix colors. I'm going to try this out today just to mix things up and see how I feel about that. If it doesn't work, I can always go back to the paper palette. And like what I discussed with you yesterday, acrylic is a medium that once dry, either on the paper or the palette or wherever, it cannot be reactivated with water. So I'm just going over it with some water and it will not reactivate. Even on the paper which I painted yesterday, the color will not reactivate. And that's very different if you're used to water-based media like gouache or watercolor. This is my gouache palette, and any of these colors, these are completely dry, but the moment I go over it with water, I can reactivate my paints. So that's something to get used to if you haven't worked with acrylic before. So now I'm going to start painting this, and the first thing I'll do is go over it with my kneadable eraser. I'm just erasing some of the harsh lines because I know that acrylic is a relatively translucent medium, so I don't want the pencil lines to show through, so I'm just erasing these off and then I'll start painting. I'll first lay in a coat for the background and then I'll start painting the subject. I'm going with a nice soft blue for the background, like a very pastel blue. So I'm using titanium white because I want the white to be very opaque. So I'm not using mixing white in this case. I'm going to be using titanium white. And then I'll just mix a touch of blue into that and try to create a really light pastel kind of blue. I do want to try to make it a little textural or brush strokey. So I'm going to try that out and see what happens. I'm using the flat brush for this, so that'll allow me to fill a larger area in one go. I'm just changing up the shade a bit as I go just to create some texture, some variation. So what I'm noticing is that you do need a sufficient amount of paint on the palette, especially when you want to cover a larger area. This canvas isn't even that large, it's just 6 by 6, but I'm still needing a good amount of paint on my palette to be able to spread it across. And this is just a first coat. I think I will go in later on with another coat over this. I've not mixed any water into my paint so far. I'm just using it as is. I'm going to tear off this palette that I used yesterday and I'm just using that as a backing because I don't want to ruin my table. You can use any kind of drawing board or something of that sort behind it. One thing I am finding a little hard to get used to is the fact that the paint dries fairly fast, and with gouache I'm used to going in and reactivating the paint. If I want to blend, I have no issue with it drying fast, so that's never something that's bothered me with gouache because I know that the moment I go in with a damp brush I can reactivate it. But that's not the case here. It just completely dries and I have to layer over it. That's the best way to work with acrylic. So that's something that's just taking a little bit of reconditioning of my brain to kind of get used to it. I think that looks pretty good as a starting point. I will now start with my base layer for the lemon and then I'll see how I want to go from there. This entire section is like a lighter section of the lemon. It's more in highlight, and that side of it is a bit more in shadow. So I'm just trying to follow that same pattern, even though this is just my first coat and I will be layering over it. I'm just following that pattern. I'm actually finding it a lot easier to blend in an actual painting. I'm also finding it easier on canvas than I found it on paper yesterday. I was really struggling. Okay, I'm quite happy with all of that as a first coat. Now my background is pretty much dry, so I'm going to try to add a little bit more texture in it, just to make it a little more interesting there. What I'm interested to explore with acrylic is more of this textured brush strokiness, which is not as easy to do with gouache because gouache is pretty flat in the way that it dries, and I mean that's the entire point of gouache, that's the quality of the medium. So I think acrylic might give me an opportunity to explore these more loose and expressive styles. Now I'm also using the burnt or raw umber mixed with the blue and white, which is the background color, just to add a bit of shadow for this lemon here. And I think I will also add a touch of yellow into it, because typically when you see shadows in real life, there is a bit of the object's color that is visible in the shadow. I think one thing I'm enjoying is that it's super easy to cover up any area that you're not happy with. You can do that even with a medium like gouache, but it takes a little bit of skill in the case of gouache, because you need to be able to layer without lifting off your base layer. Here it's fairly simple to just go over it once it dries up a bit and correct that. So that's nice. Okay, so now I'm going to go in and finish up my lemon. What I'm going to do is switch over to this filbert brush, because it has these nice rounded bristles and it's good for a round shaped object. So when I'm trying to layer a light color over the dark background, it's not giving me full coverage. I think I would require multiple coats to be able to properly do that. I think one important thing is just to make sure that you have a good amount of paint on the brush, on the canvas, on the palette, everywhere, because otherwise it's losing some of its intensity and it's becoming kind of weird and streaky, which I don't like at all. Okay, sadly my camera stopped recording again, but here's what I ended up with, and I am actually quite happy with it. I finished up my shadows there, and then I just went in and added a bit of texture with the highlights and just adding a bit of texture on the shadow side of the lemon as well. And I added a bit of detailing on the leaf and fixed a part of the background that I wasn't overly happy with, but that's about it. I think I'm leaving it at this for now. Now that I'm looking at it, there's one small thing I want to do. This section is looking like a random yellow patch, so I'm just gonna dab at that a little bit. Yeah, I really need to learn how to stop overworking my paintings. I think it was fun, but I'm sure I can do better. Let me know your tips in the comments. I would love to know. So I'm just going to let this dry overnight, and I'll check in tomorrow and let you know what I feel about it. So here's my final painting. It has dried now. It's got a kind of glossy appearance to it compared to gouache, which dries very matte. I think acrylic gouache would be a sort of in-between, where you get all the properties of acrylic, but then you get that smooth matte finish of gouache. I've done an entire video where I've tested out acrylic gouache. So if you'd like to check that out, click the link up here. So final thoughts. I'm pretty happy with what I managed to create. I didn't think I would be able to create something that looked this nice. Of course, we do need to keep in mind that though I am familiar with art and painting in general, I am completely new to this medium, so there is going to be a bit of a learning curve. But as a first attempt, I think it was pretty decent. Let me know what you think in the comments. But final thoughts. Okay, so as a gouache artist who is transitioning into acrylic paints, I think there are some pros and cons that we need to discuss. I think that as an absolute beginner to painting, acrylic should be a great medium to get started with. I kind of understand why people feel a lot less intimidated by acrylic paints. I've heard a lot of beginners say that. I didn't really understand it until now. I kind of understand it now compared to gouache, where there are a bit more of rules that you need to be aware of. This feels like something you can quite easily play with, and you can make a mess and you can have fun with it. It feels a little less intimidating. Now, my main takeaway is that the fact that once the paint dries, it can't be reactivated. It can be looked at as a pro or a con, so it completely depends on your own art style and what you like. So I am a gouache artist. I like reactivating my paints once they dry on the paper. I like to be able to blend it once it's dry. But of course, when I try to layer, I can end up reactivating the base, and that leads to a bit of problems. So in that case, something like this would be great. It would be great to work with acrylics because I can create lots and lots of layers without worrying. But with gouache, you need to be a lot more careful. But then, of course, you do lose the blendability aspect of it when it comes to acrylic. So gouache is great for that. So I think it's a lot of picking and choosing based on your applications. I did this because I wanted to just play with a new medium. It's been a while since I did something like that. I do love the textural aspect of it. I think that's something I want to explore more and play with a little bit more. So the final verdict, do I like it or do I not like it? I don't know. Like I said, there are pros and cons. I think I need to play with it a little bit more. I do not see this ever becoming, in all honesty, I don't see this ever becoming my main medium. I don't see it overtaking the love that I have for gouache. But I do see this as something that can be a good supplement. It could be something that I explore in my free time and maybe develop some paintings for very specific concepts. When I want to add more texture, maybe this is something I can play with. Maybe I can try mixed media sometime. Let's see. For now, I'm signing off, and this is it. Be sure to tune in next week because I'm going to compare gouache versus acrylic versus watercolor, and that's going to be pretty interesting now that I've had a chance to actually try out the medium. And I'm thinking in one of the coming weeks, I will also try a larger still life painting with acrylic, and I'll document how that goes. So that should be fun. Stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, comment with your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.